Well now, a huge welcome to you to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is my fourth book in the series, and this is called The Phoenix and the Creatures of Darkness. Now I want to emphasise that this is a novel, and only a novel. Yes, it is based on real people, even some celebrities, and real events. But I need to apologise to you if you feel you've identified yourself, because that was never my intention. The intention is for this simply to be a novel, an entertainment for you. Celibacy, Restraint and Tears. Always on cue, I came across a YouTube video about how psychopaths and narcissists withhold bleep as a part of their control. During the 20 years my partner withheld bleep and conversations from me, I'd already realised that it was some sort of a game, and since realising that she was a psychopath, deep down I really knew this was a part of it. Now, what did come as a revelation was that my partner would have been cheating on me. I must be clear that this is just a conjecture, as such accusations are haram to Muslims. My mother always claimed that my partner's mother had suggested to her that my partner was cheating on me with younger men. I guess it's a testament to my ex-partner's control that I'd always dismissed it, but it now seems so obvious. Branwell once claimed to have been introduced to his half-sister when with his mother, but this was at a time when he was most delusional, and so I disbelieved it. In fact, I'd assumed that he meant that his mother had had another child, and never considered that this was the child of his father, as this was ridiculous. Such infidelity and sexual promiscuity are typical of psychopaths, but I had fallen for a somewhat moralistic proclamations towards fidelity. Having lost me all of my friends, they were always short-lived friendships with males and younger couples, including many of her ex-students. I wonder if these were short-lived because they were much quicker than me in identifying their manipulation. Certainly she claimed to have been a victim of my working away from home when Branwell was young, and indeed extensively thereafter, when these provided her with the perfect opportunity to be with her latest victims. The effect on me was profound. As a man in his prime, I started drinking to suppress my libido. It also helped me to sleep, as strangely living with a psychopath seemed to interrupt my sleep patterns. It started when Branwell was born, but why did it continue? I say strangely, although I do recall having been woken up by a prod in the back on numerous occasions and being shouted at for waking her up. Then I became unable to sleep. I also recall once falling asleep while driving back from work in Birmingham on the M6 to Manchester. I awoke before there was an accident and pulled over as soon as I was able to. But drinking alcohol eventually became the habit, which pushed me into the despair that I'm still recovering from. One loses one's self-respect, and the body adjusts to the new self-image and intake of alcohol. Putting on weight is an obvious sign, which simply adds to the cycle of despair. It also means that I began to snore, providing even more opportunities to wake me. As the dark night of the soul progressed, I began to wonder if I wasn't Branwell's real father. I had no reason to doubt it, not least as certainly as a child he seemed to resemble me. That is, Apart from during a tarot reading, Branwell seemed to appear as Pinocchio. As for many years, he's rarely told the truth about anything. Well, the reader was very clear that Pinocchio was not my child. I'd been working away in London around the time of Branwell's inception, so it's entirely possible. Whilst his mother is vengeful enough to have claimed sole guardianship to spite me, it makes even more sense if he's not mine. Indeed, when we went to register his birth, she was very interested in her future ability to strike off my guardianship. Now, if Branwell was well aware of that I am not his father, could explain why he seemed to want to milk me of as much money as he could before breaking off contact with me altogether. Those of you who've followed my every episode may be aware what I have just realised. I've just been listening to a woman who's been a victim of Nigerian romance scammer, and their experience is nearly identical to mine with Branwell. Indeed, Branwell had asked me to take out loans to send him money, just as the scammers do. Furthermore, once it seemed obvious that these women had been completely drained of money, the scammers dumped them, just as Branwell has now dumped me. Despite knowing this and the revelation that Branwell may not be who I thought he was, like these victims, I still love him. I'm no longer in denial. I devoted 20 years of my life with Branwell as my son, making the most incredible sacrifices for him. I cannot simply write off such a significant chunk of my life. Indeed, momentarily, I pondered if Branwell was being directed by a Nigerian gang. After all, he claimed to have sold his passport and bank cards to one, and my mother claimed to have heard people in the background when he was demanding money from my father. Am I bitter? No, I'm not. But I do resent how the middle years of my life, and the most productive in terms of acquiring assets, were given to my psychopathic ex-partner and her son. When I explained this to Maddie, she said that she had never believed Branwell to be mine, as there's no resemblance to me. Indeed, he's tall and I'm somewhat short. But maybe more telling, Maddie said, was that my character was like my father's, and indeed are my looks, but Branwell's is completely different. And nevertheless, when he was born, I felt an immediate connection with a soulmate. But of course, that does not establish paternity, one way or another. But there will be more profound damage from alcohol abuse, such as my hypertension, my liver function, and a raft of organs which have aged beyond their time. In fact, during this time, I moved from a young man to old, losing so much of my life to servitude. Exactly the same had happened to my ex-partner's husband, who ended up a broken alcoholic. She claimed to still be completely under a spell. But maybe the bigger injustice is that she now enjoys the full fruits of my most productive years as an earner and as a business person, whilst Branwell and I live in relative poverty, and that surely was her plan all along. Yes, she came into my life with little and left with everything, apart from happiness, because that is something which eludes a psychopath. Like the rich, she has an insatiable appetite which can never be sated, and is therefore sentenced to live in the darkness for her lifetime. In fact, my ex-partner had a trigger which encouraged me to get drunk. Before going out to a party or social gathering, she would plead with me not to get too drunk. But somehow the pressure played on my mind, and inevitably I would drink far more than if she'd said nothing. My mother did exactly the same to me before my father's funeral, despite me being teetotal. Or was this simply coincidence? Of course, this was part of her plan, as psychopaths often have a strategy of not working and living off the work of others. Despite my insistence that my partner should work, she kept finding reasons not to. Not least when Branwell was young, she claimed that by not working, she was providing him with a good start in life. Of course, I now realise that far from providing Branwell with a good start in life, he was made a codependent, which ultimately destroyed him. Does this take on a different dimension if Branwell isn't my child? I'm not sure. Yes, of course it does. I wasn't allowed to bond with Branwell because he wasn't mine. I eventually provided my partner with work in my business. Sometimes her input was outstanding and at other times wanting. But the relationship problems she caused with my other employees were a constant worry. A part of the problem that she was always attempting to undermine my strategy and decisions with my employees, who turned out to be very loyal towards me, not least as I have made every effort to incorporate them and their needs within the business, which has reminded me of how my mother had done the same to my father as he developed his grocery business. And all along I believed this to be the normal relationship between a husband and wife. During such disputes, my father could never get my mother to compromise, just as I had never with my ex-partner. In other words, the arguments never get resolved. In fact, with both my mother and especially my ex-partner, the only reason they ever listened to me was to gather ammunition to throw back at me in an argument. Indeed, my mother always claimed to everyone who would listen about how hard she'd worked all her life. And now there were around 5 years when I remember my mother working, possibly hard. But the rest of her life, I recall one illness after another, which eventually prevented her from getting out of bed altogether. Eventually, when the financial crisis hit, I realised that not only would my business not provide employment for my employees, it probably would no longer for me. I told my partner that my ability to continue employing her was coming to an end and asked that she find a job to help me out. I reasoned that with her covering a part of the household expenses, I could spend some time reflecting on my new direction, maybe refocusing the business, including drastically reducing my prices, or looking for a job. Inevitably not paid as much as my business had paid me, but these could be new bases from which I might grow. She turned me down point blank, telling me that it was my role to provide for the family, and if I couldn't do that, I was a failure. Unknown to me, at the same time, it's almost a confession of being a psychopath. Nevertheless, it was this point that I realised there was no basis for our relationship of nearly 20 years, and that this was not the person to spend my twilight years with. Looking towards Southeast Asia for new markets was a risky option, but one which might have maintained my income to provide for her and Branwell. Shortly afterwards, Maddie and I collided. I certainly wasn't looking for someone else. Maddie provided me with love, the love that I'd been denied for 20 years. But most of all, I was seeking truth and authenticity, which sums up Maddie. I was also mindful that my ex-partner's father's relationship with her mother, and I could not face becoming the non-person that he'd become. Yes, her mother was at least a narcissist, if not a psychopath, and her father codependent. What I didn't realise at the time was that I was never quite happy to become the sort of codependent my father was to my mother, which I believed to be normal, but the relationships within her family were of a different magnitude. I remember when I first started to study sociology at university and asking the female lecturers about male-female relationships, without ever realising that I was trying to understand the narcissist-codependent relationship. Indeed, I wrote off the behaviour as a normal reaction to the suppression of women. Gosh, does this mean that I've learnt more in this life than my own father and my ex-partner's father? Maybe, or maybe their compliance was actually more mature. But maybe worse than all was that my ex-partner had naturally played the victim to my infidelity with Maddie, which lost me most of my few remaining friends in the UK, but also any meaningful relationship with Branwell. For years I believed myself to be a bad person for having led a double life with Maddie and destroyed our family, resulting in Branwell's schizophrenia. Yes, it was unethical to have led a double life that I did, but I now realise there was nothing ethical about my relationship with my partner. It was all a lie and manipulation. In fact, it wasn't even a relationship, simply abuse. Indeed, my infidelity was exposed by my loose tongue to somebody I now believe she was having an affair with. I recall her saying, "I didn't think you were like that," which was really meaning, "I thought my power over you was absolute and you have betrayed me." Or maybe, "I'm the only one allowed to cheat. How dare you?" Normal people do not behave as I did, because normal people are not subjected to 20 years of concerted psychological warfare. That all I did was to find a loving relationship is a testament to my strength and not my weakness, whilst poor Branwell has barely made it through. In fact, whilst my ex-partner has been complaining about Branwell's behaviour for some time, their relationship spiralled out of control following the exposure of my infidelity. It was as though my ex-partner was determined to take her anger out on Branwell. I do recall her repeatedly keeping me up all night, questioning me about Maddie. What was she like in bed? How many times do we make love, etc. The responses to which only fueled my partner's anger further, and I guess therefore the abuse of pure Branwell. To a degree, I'd been convinced that I deserved the treatment that I was getting and simply soaked it up. Or should I say, the whiskey soaked it up. Indeed, it was during this period that the physical violence between Branwell and his mother spiralled out of control, forcing me to finally doubt Branwell's sanity and ultimately the restraining order he received. To all who would listen, Maddie was a cheating whore who had selected me for my money. After all, why else would a beautiful woman, some 18 years younger than me, want me? A story which has still, and still does, influence Branwell's thinking and behaviour towards me, and was repeated by my father upon meeting Maddie. And this yet more evidence of subterfuge. Shortly afterwards, Branwell's mother ran up debts on any account I was responsible for, resulting in me losing previously first-class credit rating in the UK. She removed all trace of our previously shared home, from our previously shared home, whilst was very reluctant to move her belongings from my former office in which I was living. Something which has always perplexed me is that when her mother died, my ex-partner cried and cried, maybe for over a year. Whereas when I told Branwell about my father's death, he simply asked me for more money, not commenting on the tragedy at all. The response I'd expect from a psychopath or somebody who feels no family connection. Indeed, my own mother was more concerned about who would cook, clean and listen to her than the actual passing of my father, who she takes every opportunity to run down to me and possibly to all those who will listen. But I'm beginning to realise that every event, every social interaction is an opportunity for the psychopath to exert their control. Isn't my ex-partner's tears reminiscent of her not speaking to me for months on end and not having bleep with me for decades? I've always felt guilty about not helping her more to clear out her parents' home when the father moved out. But she would spend all day moving garbage from one room to another, shouting at me for going right and not left when we were jointly moving furniture, and crying at every memento of her father's. My inner self knew these to be tactics to annoy me and feed off my distress. Her tears were simply learnt behaviours designed to play the victim and manipulate all around, even to attract a new victim. Although I cannot discount a degree of Stockholm Syndrome, my ex-partner had unfinished business with her mother, just as she still does with me. So this really is the dark night of the soul. And I can begin to heal myself, at least on this issue, which has played on my mind since I first met Maddie over a decade ago. Given my new knowledge, there's no need to focus on how I have been a victim, simply to forgive myself. Indeed, haven't the last 3 episodes been me, in part, trying to justify my actions? Actions which I must now forgive myself for. Worse still, have the tragic events which have consumed Maddie and my lives for some 4 years been caused by our view that we deserve punishment for having found happiness in each other? Why are these revelations coming to me now? Well, because I no longer get angered by their implications. You see, we can all feel that we can handle the truth. But if we were truly confronted by the manipulation and treachery that have shaped all of our lives, most of us would become angry, even seek revenge. But once you can overcome the feelings of anger and revenge, then we are truly ready to hear the truth. I wonder what other revelations the world has for me before I can move on. A few weeks after writing this, I watched a tarot reading on YouTube, which seemingly explained everything. It confirmed that I was indeed moving towards light work, and that I was not to resist this. But Maddie was not moving along with me. It went on to explain that I saw the change very positively, as an open gate, but Maddie associated the enlightenment with losing her mind, and therefore was closing the gate on allowing further spiritual events to affect her. That is why other tarot readers were warning me that I would lose Maddie. But I now understand that I must embrace the change, but be compassionate towards Maddie. After all, there have been many times when our spiritual awareness have diverged. We've always come back together. Indeed, if I can convince Maddie that my spiritual awakening is actually protecting her, then she will respect me for taking a husband's role. Despite me knowing that Maddie has far more power than me, when I explained all this to Maddie, she clearly thought I was talking rubbish. What more confirmation do I need? A tragedy, yes, but not caused by a series of misjudgments and bad luck, but one that had been planned and executed by a psychopath. Doesn't this describe all that's happening in the world right now? Those of you who've read each of my episodes may be asking yourselves, are these about paranormal, black magic, psychological abuse, or the path to healing? And of course, it's about how they all collide, along with personal tragedies and world events. But we create our own bad luck, our own luck, be it good or bad, through our own subconscious and my feelings that I've been betrayed, that I betrayed my family, along with Maddie, and she's contributed towards this, created our own cycle of despair. There's no doubt that Omuni used black magic, some of which is probably directed against us. And Pa Angabai tried to poison us, and probably that Pa and Ibuerte joined in with Omuni to a degree. But we felt ourselves had we felt ourselves worthy of our happiness, maybe we would have remained oblivious to this and not entered into the panic of self-destruction. Now I find myself surrounded by people blaming bad luck and others for their current misfortune. And the world is telling me that whilst I should help them if I can, I need to surround myself with more positive people. A somewhat difficult task in a country, maybe now a world, which lies under a black cloud of pessimism. Nevertheless, I've found the light and the truth about unconditional love. Have I become a new ager that I so disdain? Oh dear, I hope it doesn't sound like that. The revelations continued. You'll be aware that for some time I've been attempting to define black magic, and I've eventually settled on imposing one's will on others. The more astute will realise that this definition includes almost every social interaction, be it magical or mundane, and that is my purpose. Having found the light and accepted that we're all connected and one, it seems to me that there are 3 types of people. Although this will be a continuum between 2 poles. There are those who don't seek to influence others and simply go with the flow, often believing that their lives are influenced by luck, be it good or bad. Others are fearful that they're connected in a network with other humans and seek to use this fear and darkness to impose their will on others. Then a few have discovered that they can send love and light across the network. Once again, in a very timely fashion, I have come across a pagan believer who described black magic in a similar way to me. He argued that those who emotionally blackmail others are practicing the worst form of black magic, and that suicidal threats were the most obvious sign of this. So my mother and son are engaged in emotionally blackmailing me. You'll notice the light bulb above my head, despite you, dear reader, having been aware of this for so long. So I must emotionally detach myself from the 2 people left in the country of my birth, whom I really love. Yeah, I must. Branwell, in common with his mother, tells me how let down he is by me, that I had promised him everything and had failed him. It's almost as though Branwell sees me as his victim or his host to feed off. That I've misled him over and over again and that bad karma would result. The implication being that I am responsible for his predicament. This is an obvious tactic of a psychopath. Indeed, it's almost identical to his mother's response when I told her that my business could no longer provide for the family and I needed her assistance. Indeed, his victim mentality is so typical of a psychopath. Possibly, or is he simply repeating what his mother had told him? Either way, I must finally understand that I may never have an honest relationship with the person I believed to be my own son, as all he knows is manipulation. I can never make Branwell happy, for he does not know happiness, only power, and if I'm engaging with him, it means power over me. I've always known that following a period of limited contact with my mother, she slowly draws me in again. I was seeking closure on our unhappy past relationship when she was simply relishing holding power over me again. It begins with making me feel guilty about not phoning nor visiting enough. But no matter how often I phone or visit, it's never enough. My mother's never happy. And I'm just made to feel even more guilty. You see, guilt is just a noose to pull me in. And the more I engage, the more strands are added to this noose, and the more control she has over me. There's always another hill to climb. Now I must reluctantly accept that the same is true of my son. Just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past over and over again. Buddha. Branwell's mother had a restraining order on him, which appears to have terrified him, having spent one night in the cells at Trafford Police Headquarters. Nevertheless, he has repeatedly asked me to intervene with his mother. I now realise that this is he seeking another attempt to manipulate his mother. But long ago, his mother had worked out that as a fellow narcissist, he knows only too well that she needs to break off contact altogether. Oh dear, these are the feelings and actions that I find completely incompatible with what I see as being a good father, even with being a good person. But I must learn. This also sheds so much light on my life. There's always been someone threatening to kill themselves beside me. It's as though there's always someone that wanted to keep me in their cage, like an animal on show, and their threats of suicide were the lock and key. All seemed to feel a sense of entitlement, that they alone should have me to themselves, like a household pet. How I've tortured myself for feelings of not being able to make everyone around me happy, when in fact these people were feeding off my energy. Like the parasites I have reported, or maybe indicating that they themselves are possessed by these parasites. So I really am being asked to abandon my last 63 years and be reborn in the light. Not only does it, but it is telling me to abandon those who are constantly complaining about bad luck, ill health, etc., as they're simply draining my positive energy without it really helping them. This does not mean having no compassion for those in the darkness, but I must stop trying to understand them and simply see their problems as darkness. But it does mean that I must stop following the news and conspiracies on the alternative media, as they too are designed to harvest my energy. In order to more fully understand this reality, we must take into account other dimensions of a broader reality. John Archibald Wheeler. Well, that concludes this chapter from my fourth book, The Phoenix and the Creatures of Darkness, and it's actually the final in this series of books. I'm not saying I won't write another book, but I feel this series is now complete. I really hoped you enjoyed it. And now I'm going to add a new chapter every week to this book. So if you want to hear about it, subscribe and hit the bell. Now, I'm not doing particularly well with these eBay, YouTube algorithms. So if you could hit the like button and make some comments, I think it helps me. I hate to ask you for this. I hate it when I hear people coming out with this sort of statement. But the truth is that this has been like a full-time job for the last 4 years of my life. And I'm still a long way off from receiving any money whatsoever for it. So I really do need to, I suppose, beg you. Subscribe, like, make comments. And thank you very much. Thanks.